Top 10 waiver wire adds for week 10. We are inching closer and closer to the fantasy playoffs, and we are heading into another 4-team bye week. The Cincinnati Bengals, Dallas Cowboys, Kansas City Chiefs, and Tennessee Titans. That is a lot. But luckily for us, there are still some very interesting waiver wire adds this week, so let's go ahead and dive right in. Let's kick things off with one of the guys from my waiver wire stash video this weekend. Tory Horton, have yourself a day. Tory Horton, you guys, if you're subscribed, you already know. He had 4 receptions on 48 yards, 2 touchdowns. In the stash video, I talked about his lack of recent production. And when I say lack, I mean like literally zero, but that we were willing to forego it because Cooper Kupp had simply been the priority in the offense. And because the offense runs so aggressively through Jackson, Smith, and Jigba, there really wasn't any room for a wide receiver 3 to be consistently productive. But Horton has talent, and given the opportunity, he was bound to step up, and step up he absolutely did. Heading into this game, Horton had 3 touchdowns actually on the season, just 9 receptions to get those 3 touchdowns. That's actually legitimately insane. He's truly an electric player. So it was literally just a matter of getting him touches. Now we don't have a timeline on Cooper Kupp's injury because again, it is 2 injuries. It is a heel injury and a hamstring injury. Both of those do tend to be red flag injuries for multi-week absences, especially considering Cooper Kupp's age and his injury history, specifically with hamstrings, and the fact that he has missed a minimum of 5 games in the past 3 seasons. Tory Horton is definitely a priority add here. Welcome back, JJ McCarthy. McCarthy was the top player on my waiver wire stash video, and he absolutely crushed it in his return. Mind you, this is only his 3rd career start. Now, to be fully transparent, I thought that he would have a great fantasy day because he would deliver in garbage time, because I expected the Lions offense to jump out on Minnesota early, but JJ McCarthy actually led his team to victory and gave us a borderline QB1 performance. Now, it did come exactly the way that I said it would in terms of stats. Young mobile quarterbacks tend to give us fantasy points without throwing for high volume. My exact words were that it would be, quote unquote, extremely mediocre pass volume, less than 200 yards with like 13 completions, and somehow wind up with a QB1 performance. And what do you know? 14 receptions, 143 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and 1 on the ground. I call it like I see it. McCarthy has everything that we look for in a QB1. A big arm, rushing upside, and a bevy of weapons. It is tough to fail when you are throwing to Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, and Aaron Jones. Now, he's got a matchup this week against a very beatable Baltimore Ravens defense, and at the very least, a good offense led by Lamar Jackson that should ensure good back and forth in this game. JJ McCarthy will shoot up rankings in week 10, particularly with all the quarterbacks on a bye and unfortunate injuries. Parker Washington had a monster game with 8 receptions on 9 targets for 90 yards and dominated, playing the most snaps of any skill position outside of Trevor Lawrence, of course. Now, we don't have a exact timeline on Travis Hunter's injury or a ton of details. It was non-contact. They said his ACL is okay, but he is clearly going to miss at least 3 more games. We talked about Washington, another hit, in our waiver wire stash video, and I debated whether we wanted Washington or De'Ami Brown as the wide receiver that we wanted to pick up. Washington and Hunter don't play the exact same role, so it wouldn't be a 1-for-1 replacement. Instead, we would expect to see a shift to a more prominent role for Washington overall, and that is exactly what we saw this week. Trevor Lawrence spread the ball around fairly evenly, but the key takeaway here is that we did not see much of an impact from Brian Thomas Jr. At this point, we have to hope, for our purposes, that he finds himself and reasserts himself as the wide receiver 1 of this offense, because what we saw last season was just far too dominant to just disappear. But at this point, when you look at the matchups ahead, particularly Houston next week, it is difficult to trust Brian Thomas Jr. as the clear volume wide receiver 1, and they have to push more targets somewhere else. A shift in targets favoring Washington does make a lot of sense. And De'Ami Brown left the game with a concussion. Even if the Jags offense is struggling as a whole from a volume perspective, Washington has consistently drawn a significant number of targets compared to the remaining receivers, making him the more viable fantasy option right now. Tyrone Tracy was a top waiver wire add last week, but I did caution you to just temper your expectations and be careful, because we are talking about a running back who straight up lost his job earlier this season to Cam Scatterbo. A lead back is a lead back, but we couldn't assume that Tracy would be one of those league-winning upside ads, right? Once you lose trust and you lose that stranglehold on the lean back role, you might not necessarily be the next clear man up. I expected it to be a little bit of a committee here. I do a weekly video with Fantasy Pros that drops on Tuesday called 5 Moves to Make. One of those moves that I talked about was to sell Tyrone Tracy, because if you don't necessarily need him, you could sell him high to someone looking to make a quick grab for an RB1 and capitalize it, because Tracy's job might be a little bit more volatile than people realize. I got a lot of pushback on that. People were not happy, but this week unfortunately showed exactly why I said to capitalize and trade Tracy. Because unfortunately, what we saw was a committee between Tracy and Devin Singletary, and Singletary was the more effective back, and he had the more valuable touches. Tracy had 5 carries for 18 yards and 3 receptions on 4 targets for 19 yards, while Singletary had 8 carries for 43 yards and 2 receptions on 2 targets for 8 yards. And what's worse, Singletary outsnapped Tracy, and Singletary was the preferred back at the goal line. Ultimately, we probably don't trust either one of these backs, but we can't be picky here, so Singletary is worth an add. Because again, what I mentioned was that Cam Scatterbo being out could easily mean that we get an uptick of red zone runs from Jackson Dart, and lo and behold, that is exactly what we saw, a rushing touchdown for Jackson Dart. But again, Singletary is worth the ad because of those snaps there. We had Colston Loveland on the waiver wire ad video and the stash video last week with the injury to Colt Kmet. This week, Kmet came back, and we were anticipating Colston Loveland not being fantasy viable, but Kmet got injured again during the game, putting Loveland back on the table. Now, we do have to be realistic because this injury was a concussion, so technically speaking, we're probably not looking at a multi-week injury here, but I would anticipate that he would likely be out in week 10 against the Giants and then back in week 11 against Minnesota. Still, Ben Johnson is an intelligent and savvy coach, and it is tough to imagine that he looks at this breakout performance from Loveland. 6 receptions on 7 targets for 118 yards and 2 touchdowns, one of which was a breakaway game-winning score, and puts him on the back burner again. We also have to note that Luther Burden was missing from the game as well, though he hasn't been a major factor. That is a factor in terms of presence on the field. Loveland is worth a speculative add to see if he can continue this hot streak next week if Kmet is out, and potentially steal that role as the future of the franchise. Friendly reminder to check your waiver wire to see if Tez Johnson is available. The only thing holding people back from rostering Johnson and feeling good about it is the uncertainty around Chris Godwin's return. I get that, but until we have clarity, Johnson is the wide receiver 2 in the offense that should rebound, right, after a rough couple of games from Baker Mayfield, hopefully coming out of the bye week stronger here. Now, Johnson has scored at least 9 fantasy points in each of the past 4 games and has 2 touchdowns despite Mayfield's struggles. Remaining fantasy relevant even when passing volume is below expectations is a great sign for Tez Johnson. He plays very well off of Emeka Egbuka and has shown both a solid floor and a decent ceiling, making him very worthy of a roster spot. The road ahead is not particularly easy, but they've got a good stretch of facing good offenses that ensure the Bucs push the pass, and they do have soft-ish matchups coming up as well. Nothing that Baker Mayfield can't handle, and we should expect him to have a bounce back. Again, Travis Hunter is on IR. Brian Thomas Jr. left the game with an ankle injury, but again, quite frankly, he was not doing much before the injury. De'Ami Brown left the game with a concussion. We talked about all of this with Parker Washington, but at this point, it is all hands on deck for anyone that has talent in this Jags offense, because they're going to have to start rolling out practice squad players at receiver at this point. Travis Etienne had a fine day, but they have to get additional talent to add a spark to this offense, and that is exactly why we saw an increased usage of Bhayshul Tuten this week. Now, to be clear, there was not an increase in snaps specifically. Travis Etienne played over 50% of snaps. Bhayshul Tuten hovered around 25%, and he actually was outsnapped by LaQuint Allen Jr., but actual touches are more critical than just pure snaps here. I just want to mention the stats to emphasize that we are not seeing Travis Etienne's job taken away. The usage for Tuten was very diverse here. We saw him utilized all throughout the game and in the red zone as well. Again, with all the injuries, they're going to have to lean on the run. The run game in general has been down prior to this game, but as I talked about before, that is because they have just been in terrible matchups against the run. Now, the road ahead is not run friendly, but if they continue to lean heavily on the run, both running backs would be relevant. Tuten is worth an add to see if this production sticks. I have been hesitant to lean into Alec Pierce because I firmly believe the pecking order in terms of trustworthiness from a fantasy perspective on a week-to-week basis in the Colts offense is Michael Pittman, followed closely by Tyler Warren, then Josh Downs, and finally Alec Pierce. So being the fourth fantasy option on an offense is never ideal. And then when you add into that Jonathan Taylor commanding the workload that he does on the ground, it just becomes harder to find consistent opportunities. Now, Pierce is actually the wide receiver too in terms of snaps over Josh Downs, but Downs has been the more consistent player from a fantasy perspective. But the good thing about Pierce is that he is a deep threat, which means that when he hits, he provides boom games for us. He is the highest ADOT of the entire Colts offense and has shown the ability to garner double-digit targets in high-volume matchups twice this season, including against Pittsburgh, where he had 6 receptions on 13 targets for 115 yards. He doesn't have a touchdown yet, and his production does come in bunches, but he has shown upside before. At this point, we would rather lean into rostering a high upside option like him on our benches than someone who offers mediocre production. Okay, so hear me out. We got to put this one in perspective here. You guys know that I believe in Kayshon Boutte. Unfortunately, this was not a spectacular day for him. He got injured. He only played 25% of snaps. Stephon Diggs had a fine day, but it was Demario Douglas who led the way with 4 receptions on 6 targets for 100 yards and a touchdown. Now, I caution you to not jump aggressively on this production. Put in a modest claim here, very, very modest here, because of the injury to Kayshon Boutte. They do not play similar roles. Douglas primarily plays in the slot while Boutte operates on the outside. Kyle Williams clearly was the big beneficiary in terms of time on the field replacing Kayshon Boutte, but he only had 1 target. Douglas still remained very low in his snaps. However, again, we do have to contextualize those snaps. Getting more doesn't necessarily mean that you have more in terms of trustworthiness with the quarterback looking your way, and it is very clear that Drake May trusts Demario Douglas, and they are very intentional with his usage. Drake May has been consistently targeting the receiving core over the past couple of weeks, more so than he was the tight ends earlier in the season. Now, with Kayshon Boutte, we know that hamstring injuries are often multi-week injuries, so you might have a small window here where Douglas sees an uptick in production. But again, be cautious. Perhaps Douglas, being the most reliable receiver outside of Diggs, will increase his snaps, but it seems unlikely. And this production will not be sticky once Kayshon Boutte is healthy. Still, Drake May is operating at such a high level that you do want to roster one of his primary receivers. Okay, so I really didn't want to be right on this one. I talked about Terrell Jennings in our waiver wire stash video. I want our stashes to hit, but I did want to see a good game from Travion Henderson. I wanted him to take over as the lead back and truly dominate and showcase the talent that he has. But as I speculated, the Patriots remained in a committee. Now, Henderson had the more productive day. 14 carries, 55 yards, 4 receptions, 6 targets, 32 yards. Jennings had 11 carries, 35 yards, but he got the touchdown and had a reception for 1 yard. Now, the snaps, though, they were not remotely close, which is why Jennings is way back at the bottom of this list, because there is ultimately no role for him if Ramondre Stevenson is healthy, and he was definitely playing a clear 1B to Henderson's 1A. And again, we don't have a timeline here on Ramondre Stevenson, so that's why he is on this list. It is a toe injury, and we know how fickle those can be. Look at Brock Purdy, right? We do not have a ton of specifics, but if it lingers around, I would expect Jennings to remain relevant in a committee with Henderson. And if Jennings is a preferred back in the red zone, that is also someone that we want to roster. Now, bonus ad, I'm not exactly happy about this bonus ad. I'm a Packers fan, so I'm really, really bummed out about this bonus ad. But with a ton of tight ends being rostered, you might be in a tough spot if you lost Tucker Kraft. Tucker Kraft is out for the year with a torn ACL. It's brutal, which is a massive blow to the Packers offense, an offense that has heavily relied on him this season. Romeo Doubs has been an adequate wide receiver 1. Christian Watson has returned and looks solid early. And at some point, we will get Jaden Reed back. But if Kraft has such a consistent presence in this Packers offense, they're going to need to replace that. Now, heading into this week, the Packers' target distribution was 42 targets to Romeo Doubs, 41 to Tucker Kraft. That is essentially even there. Kraft was often operating as the first look here and the most consistent option. And then Matthew Golden coming in third at 26. Now, Kraft also has had 6 touchdowns on the season, and they have to fill that role in this offense. Usually when we lose a starting tight end, we don't feel super comfortable turning to the backup, but in this case, the backup is Luke Musgrave, a tight end that was ironically drafted in the exact same draft and actually taken earlier than Tucker Kraft. Musgrave is a fine tight end. He was a good prospect. Kraft was just simply better. And that is very evident on the field. Still, the Packers will now turn to Musgrave, and they do trust him. And while I don't expect the same level of upside as Tucker Kraft, because he is not Tucker Kraft, Musgrave can still be a borderline tight end one on a weekly basis, given the way that the Packers have leaned on that position. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. You can find me across all social media platforms at It's Terra Time, so make sure that you're tuned in and subscribed and turning on notifications, because I'm bringing you more fantasy football content all season long. Every week I've got you covered with top waiver wire ads and stashes and live shows where you can ask me any questions that you have, and so much more.